Let me know.
Yeah, it's recording, I think so. Anish, you can start now.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, sorry for the delay. And yeah, thank you all for joining us today. I would briefly introduce the teachers group. This group, Teachers Against the Climate Crisis, or TAC, was set up a little less than a year ago. And its broad purpose was to deepen engagement around different aspects of the climate crisis among teachers and through them students, and try to get them to engage in different ways, including understanding and politically. Before the lockdown, we had some meetings in colleges and so on, but since then we've been having online webinars like today, and today is the 13th in our series. So before I hand it on to Anish, who would chair the meeting, I just briefly say what the structure is this, that we have Dr. Malm, Andreas Malm, and he would be speaking for about 40 minutes, and after which we'll be opening it out for discussion. And in case any of you are interested in our future talks or our activities, we'll put out our email address in the chat box in a little while. So once again, thank you all for joining, and let me sort of pass it on to Anish. Thanks.
So hello everyone, thanks again for joining us. It's a special pleasure to welcome Dr. Andreas Malm, who's going to be speaking today. He is Associate Professor of Human Ecology at Lund University, but a dry institutional introduction doesn't capture the tone of his interventions, I think, in the ongoing discussions about the climate crisis, which have been both lively and illuminating, whether in the meticulous historical tracing of the origins of fossil capital, or in his very sharp commentary about what methodological and philosophical approaches can best help us to know the terrain of struggle better. On this latter, his book, The Progress of this Storm, is characteristically bracing with a wonderful critique, I think, of Bruno Latour's work and other work in that vein, but also some of his critiques of Deepesh Chakrabarty's work would be of interest to many people here. Indeed, all of his work carries with it both careful scholarship and the sense of urgency and the urgent radical action that is needed in the present. His lecture today will promise to strike the same chord. Since the financial crisis of 2008, we've seen the rise of right-wing populisms across much of the world. Nationalism, racism, and other forms of emotive identification have been deployed to mobilize a profound disenchantment with the current state of affairs. The far right in US, Europe, Brazil, and many other parts of the world has managed to link existing discourses of racism to a celebration of, or is it a nostalgia for, the most carbon-guzzling forms of industrialization. A popular constituency for climate denialism has been created on this basis, and it is urgent to understand the historical roots of this connection. It's also particularly interesting to engage with this question here in India for at least two reasons. First, because we have our own far right in power, which seems to contrast actually with this global trajectory. The Sangh Parivar here doesn't seem to consistently peddle climate denialism, but rather finds other Hindu nationalist idioms to variously avoid, harness, or soft pedal the issue. Perhaps there are clues in the global history Dr. Malm lays out to better understand our own dilemmas as well. Equally, however, much of the link between racism and the celebration of steam and coal are rooted in imperialism, not least in the mechanics of British imperialism in India. So there's another connection there. So without much further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Malm, and please proceed for as long as you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anish, for that very generous introduction. I hope you can all hear me. I wish I could meet you in person, in real life, but increasingly this is how you meet people nowadays, in front of a screen, which is a pretty poor substitute for actual human interaction in my view, but we all know the reasons for this, and it doesn't get much, well, this is as good as it gets under the current circumstances. So what I'll try to do today is just lay out some of the historical findings, if you like, that are included in a book that I have written together with the Zetkin collective. This book is called White Skin, Black Fuel on the Dangers of Fossil Fascism, and will be out from Verso early next year. It will actually be out in French before that. And this book came out of some extra panic around the climate issue that started to boil in me and some of my comments. So I should say that the Zetkin collective is a collective of 20 people. It's students and scholars and activists working on the political ecologies of the far right. Mostly, well, it's formed around the Human Ecology Division in Lund, Lund University in southern Sweden. Just as Anish laid out, we've had this trend, most well known, of course, as represented by Donald Trump on the world scale. We've had this trend of a far right of the past years that has gained in popular support and come to power and formed cabinets or become the major opposition. This far right combining various forms of nationalism and xenophobia and racism with anti-climate politics, very often in the form of brazen, explicit denial that the problem exists whatsoever. This is the position of Donald Trump, of Jair Bolsonaro, and of many far-right parties in Europe as well. So what we did in this book was we looked at what the far-right has done around energy and climate in 13 European countries and the US and Brazil. So we did not look at India, which is, as we actually write in the book, probably the major omission, given India's importance and the fact that it's ruled by a far-right party. So I apologize for this. But hopefully there will be some relevance. And anyway, because what happens in countries like the US and Brazil or Poland and Norway, two of the major fossil fuel producers in Europe, is a global affair because emissions, as we know, don't stop at national borders. So we and future generations will suffer from the accelerated fossil fuel combustion and deforestation undertaken by these parties and presidents. Now, I'm not going to go much more into detail on the contemporary scene. Let me just say that there's another kind of far-right response to the climate crisis and the ecological crisis generally that is probably most prominent in France, and that's what we call green nationalism. So it's a kind of nationalist politics that is shrouded in environmentalist garb, if you like. And this trend, which is also sometimes called Eco-Fascism, came to the fore in 2019 with the massacre at Christchurch in New Zealand and then in El Paso in Texas, where both perpetrators of these massacres claimed that they were killing Muslims and Latinos respectively to protect the environment and the climate by extension, or explicitly as well in the case of the Christchurch killer. So there's another current within the far right, but the predominant one is climate denial. So the problem doesn't exist, and it's nothing for us to worry about. And we try to, after having mapped this field, we try to understand where does this current come from and how has it gained so much popular support in Western countries in recent years. Why is this? And more deeply, what is the link between energy and environment and racism as a historical and social phenomenon? And one explanation, well, I should say that we argue that the link or the racist dimensions of the climate crisis are some of the most ignored and poorly explored and under-researched aspects of this problem. There is a dearth of scholarship and generally research on the racist, racism and climate change. But one explanation that floats around when this topic arises is that the people that suffer most from global heating are generally non-white people in the peripheries of the world system. There was a brief parenthesis to this normality in the summer of 2018 when we had massive droughts and wildfires in Europe, as some of you might recall, which gave rise to Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement and Extinction Rebellion and things like that. But generally, the situation which we've had this summer, for instance, is that we have very serious impacts of climate change hitting non-white people, such as in Yemen, where you've had disastrous floods this year, or in Bangladesh, where you had, I think, up to a third of the country underwater. I'm sure there have been unreported climate disasters in India this summer as well. Massive flooding in China, and so on and so forth. And if you have climate disasters striking closer to home in the US, for instance, it's often people of color who suffer the most. And in a world where non-white people's lives seem to matter little, global warming can then be of limited concern, because for people who identify as white in the core of the world system, this seems to be a problem out there for others who we don't really care about, because they're the wretched of the earth and they live in trash and they are trash and whatever. And this is an attitude that is quite often explicitly articulated by the far right. So in my own country, in Sweden, for instance, we have the Sweden Democrats, which is formerly a Nazi party, but that has become respectable and is now either the second largest or the largest in the polls in Sweden over the past year. So it's a typical European far right party. And in spring 2018, the climate spokesman for this party explained the party's complete lack of interest in the climate change issue by saying that this is a problem for the developing countries. It's not a problem for us. And ironically, just a few weeks later, we had this massive drought and wildfire season in Sweden in 2018 that prompted Greta Thunberg to start her strike. But still, the Sweden Democrats and other parties like them hold on to the line and double down on denial. And this seems to have something to do with the fact that the impacts of the climate crisis primarily hit non-whites outside of the metropolis in modern capitalism, contemporary capitalism. But and now I'm going to come to the real core of this lecture. We argue that this is one explanation, but it's not sufficient, because there seems to be a link between identities of whiteness that the far right mobilizes, and not only and fossil fuels as such, or the technologies that fossil fuels animate. So we argue that it's more than a question of the distribution of impacts. It's also a question of deep historical entanglements between between racism and modern fossil fuel technology. And they have roots that are deeply entwined, and this is what we try to go into in this section that I'll now try to present. So the research question, if you like, of this section of our book is, how did it happen that ideas of whiteness and what white people are and their privileges, how did they become bound up with fossil fuel technologies? This must have happened over time in history. And the period to look at is, just, if you want to start by going to the origins, is the 19th century, because that's when large-scale fossil fuel combustion took off, starting in Britain and then spreading through the British Empire. And it's also a key period in the development of modern racism. So what I'll do now for the next few minutes is to really go back into history and bracket the present trends for some time, and look at some of the things that happened in the early 19th century. So a key technology in the spread of large-scale fossil fuel combustion was the steamboat. But before 1840, steamboats had never been tested on the battlefield of a major war. But in the summer of that year, the British Empire sent a squadron of steamboats to the coasts of Lebanon and Palestine because tensions between the British Empire and Muhammad Ali were coming to a head. Now, Muhammad Ali, he was nominally a pasha under the Ottomans, but he had used his power base in Egypt to carve out his own Arab empire, stretching all the way from Cairo to almost all the way to Istanbul. And perhaps an even greater offense in the eyes of Britain was his campaign for building a modern manufacturing industry centered on cotton. And the diplomatic machinery of the empire couldn't stand him. For my own part, I hate Muhammad Ali, whom I consider as nothing but an arrogant barbarian, wrote Lord Palmerston, the mighty foreign secretary, in 1839. And furthermore, I look upon his boasted civilization of Egypt as the arrogantest humbug. And London grew more belligerent by the month. No, the consul general in Alexandria warned the Pasha, it is in the power of England to pulverize you. We must strike at once, rapidly and well. The ambassador in Istanbul sent home his advice. And then, here I quote again, the whole tottering fabric of what is ridiculously called the Arab nationality will tumble to pieces. And with such words ringing through the corridors of Whitehall, the Royal Navy sent 4 shining new steamboats towards Beirut. And their commander, Charles Napier, he stood on board the Gorgon, a vessel propelled by a 350 horsepower steam engine with room for 380 tons of coal. This was the first true fighting steamship in history. And it was coal that gave it propulsive force. So short on the fuel, while reconnoitering the Levantine coast, Commander Napier sent a call to several officers. You must send me coal vessels here at all costs because steamers without coal are useless, he wrote. And the coal arrived. And on 9th September 1840, the bombardment of Beirut commenced. Much of the city was destroyed. And then Napier steered south and chased the Egyptian forces from one coastal fortress to another. Steam, he reported back to London, gives us great superiority and we shall keep them moving. Latakia, Trablus, Saida, Sur, and Haifa, cities along the Levantine coast, fell like dominoes, the enemy retreating under the relentless, unpredictable attacks. And then Napier proceeded to the decisive battle at the Palestinian port town of Akka. And the old Crusader capital of Akka had been garrisoned by the Egyptians with thousands of soldiers. It was the sturdiest fortress and main depot on the coast, and therefore it was filled with ammunition. And in early November, the 4 steamboats reached Akka, followed some days later by sailing ships that had been detained by weak winds. The fleet was arrayed in front of the town with the steamers in the center, so as to make maximum use of their mobility. Massive shelling commenced. The Arabs returned the fire from inside Akka, but the steamboats constantly shifted their positions and easily evaded the shells. Then suddenly a deafening detonation ripped through the battlefield. Like a volcano eruption, a column of smoke and debris rose from within Akka. Very similar to what happened in Beirut the other week. One testimony said, the smoke rested for a few moments like an immense black dome obscuring everything. So one of the steamboats had hit the great powder magazine inside the town and it had exploded. And correspondence between the British commanders suggests that they were in fact aware of the position of this powder magazine and had planned to target it. And the explosion concluded the battle. It completely destroyed the city of Akka and killed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people at least. When the British soldiers entered Akka, they were greeted by utter devastation. Here is one testimony. Corpses of men, women, and children, blackened by the explosion of the magazine and mutilated in the most horrid manner by the cannon shot, lay everywhere about, half buried among the ruins of the homes and fortifications. Women were searching for the bodies of their husbands and children for their fathers. End quote. None of the 4 steamboats had a single man killed or wounded in this battle, but another resource was exhausted in the action, coal. And when the silence fell over the body-strewn beaches of Akka, none of the steamers had more than 1 day's supply on board, nearly all of their coal having been burnt in the pulverization of Akka. This battle ended the war in one fell stroke. Muhammad Ali surrendered completely, and his empire and cotton industry collapsed. And in the following year, in 1841, this success was repeated in the far more famous First Opium War, in which another squadron of steamboats, as you probably know, prized open China for trade. And after these achievements, the Observer printed a eulogy to steam. I quote, "In the Chinese waters, as well as on the coast of Syria, its employment, the employment of steam, has produced results which astonished mankind. In the extreme west of Asia, as well as in the extreme east, in China and in Palestine, it has finished wars which under former circumstances might have been protracted to infinity. But even these achievements, great and important as they are, do not seem to bear any proportion to those which are still possible to that wondrous power. Steam, even now, almost realizes the idea of military omnipotence and military omnipresence. It is everywhere, and there is no withstanding it." End quote. The Mechanics magazine was even more excited, I quote, "Let war come to a conflict of steam engines, and all the barbarian rabble of the world, Turks and Tartars, Arabs, Indians, Africans, and Chinese, must obviously be out of question at once." Since I don't see you, I don't know if you can hear me and follow me, but I speak out into the void and just pray that you hear
Can
me.
you well?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah. Now, up until the second quarter of the 19th century, the British Empire was built with wind. Colonies, bases, naval battles, and blockades were won by means of sailing ships. Yet for all its supremacy on the seas, the metropolis encountered limits on precisely this count. The reliance on wind restricted the latitude of power. Sailing upstream on rivers was a slow and arduous task, if possible at all. Imperial stations were generally located on shorelines or islands in the nature of two holes. On the Indian subcontinent, in China, the Levant, West Africa, and Latin America, the wind-dependent empire mostly had to stay on the margins, unable to fully penetrate the interiors. Steamboats promised to take it straight into the hearts of those dark continents. Wind belonged to the flow of energy coursing through the landscape and shifting in time from 1 hour of gale to another of calm, often too feeble to carry a ship against the current. But the stock of energy would set the waterborne empire free from such restrictions. Taken out of the repositories of energy from the very distant past, belonging neither to the landscape nor the weather in which the boats operated, coal allowed captains to go against the wind and the tide. This fuel was entirely in the hands of its masters. But the rotative steam engine that could propel vehicles such as boats required more than coal from the mines of Britain. A steam engine was built of various metal parts rubbing against each other. This produced friction, and so the owner had to apply oil. Unless regularly lubricated, the engine would simply break down. From where then did the British owners of steam engines get their oil? They got it from the Niger Delta. By far the most important lubricant in early 19th century British industry was palm oil, almost exclusively imported from West Africa, predominantly the banks of the river Niger, where nuts from palm trees were turned into oil through a burdensome process performed by women. Animal fats were neither sufficient nor suitable, whereas palm oil was perfect for lubricating not only steam engines, but also railway carriages, spinning mules, and other machines. And were it not for all that oil, those machines would have literally come to a standstill. Now, as the adoption of steam power and the mechanization of British industry advanced in leaps and bounds in the second quarter of the 19th century, the importation of palm oil exploded. From 1807, the year when the empire officially prohibited the slave trade, to the 1840s, the annual quantity ferried to Britain increased by a factor of more than 200. Like all seagoing commerce up to that point, this trade was conducted by wind. So British merchants had to dock at trading posts on the mouth of the river Niger and wait for native partners to come down with the goods. The local kingdoms resisted foreign penetration, and as long as they had to trust to the wind, the British had no physical or mechanical weapon to overcome them. Instead, they were forced to deal with middlemen and brokers, backed up by autonomous chiefs and kings who delivered the palm oil as and when they saw fit. And when demand increased, this system turned into a source of deep frustration. British traders complained ever louder about the natives obstructing the trade, slowing it down, sometimes suspending it entirely. But the solution to this embarrassing predicament came fortuitously in the shape of the steam engine itself. With its power, the merchants could pierce through the delta, bypass the coastal states, reach the producers directly, and pour the palm oil freely into their chests. The brothers Richard and John Lander, the first British explorers to map the course of the Niger in 1830, laid out the vision. I quote, "The first effect of a trade being opened will be to do away with the monopoly near the mouth of the river, which has hitherto been held by the chiefs of the lower countries. Steamboats will penetrate up the river and will defy the efforts of these monopolists to arrest their progress. The steam engine, the grandest invention of the human mind, will be a fit means of conveying civilization among these uninformed Africans who, incapable of comprehending such a thing, will view its arrival among them with astonishment and terror." End quote. The first steam-powered expedition set out in 1832 under the leadership of the shipper MacGregor Laird. 2 boats drove up the river. Naturally, the inhabitants of the delta were not happy about it. In a casual tone, Laird narrated how they took shots at his boat, and in one rebellious area, quote, "We agreed to land and burn the town as an example to the rest," end quote. Such scenes were repeated throughout the expedition. During one ambush, massive casualties were inflicted on the sailors, and one of the killed was, in fact, a Swede. This expedition ended in disaster, with most of the crewmen perishing in battles and diseases. But Laird had actually demonstrated that the River Niger and its riches were accessible by steamboats. And he ended his 2-volume account of the events with a manifesto for what we might call steam imperialism. "We have a power," he wrote, I quote, "we have a power bequeathed to us by the immortal Watt. By his invention, every river is laid open to us. Time and distance are shortened. This power, which has only been in existence for a quarter of a century, has rendered rivers truly the highway of nations and made easy what it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish without it. We are the chief repository of it. Our mineral wealth, that is the coal reserves of Britain, and the mechanical habits of our people give us a superiority over all others in the application of it." End quote. This vision actually came true, in a sense, during the second half of the 19th century, when Laird's company ran regular steamship services between Britain and the Niger Delta, and his boats were plying up and down the river and back and forth between the West African coast and the metropolis. And the result was a second, even more marvelous explosion in the palm oil trade. And similar outflows were set off from Egypt, whose lands were converted to the production of raw cotton for British mills. The once prosperous Egyptian cotton mills collapsed completely after the Battle of Akka, and that war ended. And this import of raw cotton accounted for more than half of the supplies coming into the metropolis from 1848 onwards. But the fates of the peoples of the Nile and the Niger were representative generally for what happened in what came to be known as the Third World. The peripheries of the capitalist world economy were bound in the position of suppliers of raw materials to the core. And that fundamental division of labor, so important for the course of modern history, had of course been under construction for some time, but the 19th century was a period of exceptionally rapid divergence between core and periphery. And that divergence was most dramatic over the half century 1820 to 1817. Here we're drawn Jeffrey G. Williamson, a bourgeois economic historian who's written a book called Trade and Poverty When the Third World Fell Behind. And in passing, he also notes that peoples in these southern parts of the planet were not at all thrilled and excited about submitting to imperial trade, but the naval muscle of the industrial leaders made them comply. And those muscles were nourished by a fossil fuel. And it had enormous effects on the location in society that we know as whiteness. Up to this point, before the 19th century, racism European racism had been infused with religious themes, and white people who lay claim to superiority most often invoked religion. So for instance, the early enslavement of Africans was justified with what was known as the curse of Ham, a very creative interpretation of a passage in Genesis where Ham happens upon his father Noah without clothes and is punished with a curse. And then assuming that black people were the descendants of Ham, they would have to pay for his crime, seeing his father naked, by forever being slaves. This story was actually circulated as the justification for turning Africans into slaves for centuries. But over the course of the 19th century, whiteness was placed on another footing. And we draw here on a very important book by Michael Addos called Machines as the Measure of Men, Science, Technology, and Ideologies of Western Dominance, that documents the shift to another measure of human worth. People who mastered nature stood above those who did not. So in the 19th century, the stories told in Europe instead, well, they shifted from a religious key to one that focused on technology and the marvels of engineering and mastery of nature. So it was said that, for instance, it would never occur to Africans to push aside large stones that blocked the path. And Indians, of course, venerated cows, very retarded. On the dark continents, people lived in thatched huts, surrounded by wild animals, at the mercy of unmanaged, untamed nature. Europeans alone had cracked the secret codes of nature and yoked her power to machines. So now it was their material achievements that set them off from all others, who were now perceived as primitives, as residues from earlier stages of evolution. So essentially inhabiting another time, non-white peoples were the children of mankind, so immature that they bowed down to the forces of nature and let them go to waste. They deserved to be ruled. So now it was the industrious whites above all others. And this crucial mutation of European racism happened precisely at the moment in time when steam-powered technology seemed to establish European dominance over all others, including China and the Middle East, that had previously been held in some esteem for their arts and monuments of civilization. The steamboats, the railways, and all the other steam-powered machines of white Europe really was pivotal to this emergence of modern racism. And travelers boarded those vehicles, steam-powered vehicles, on triumphal processions through the colonies and sent home word of the shock and awe. I'll take an example from India, where Whig intellectual Harriet Martineau shared her impressions of natives quivering before the British steam engines. She toured the country on a train and she wrote, I quote, "Under the Western Ghats," I'm not sure how to pronounce it exactly, "the villagers come out at the sound of the steam whistle, and the babies gasp and cry as the train rushes by. And nobody denies that the railway is a wonderful thing," end quote. So the Hindus saw their world shatter, their inborn ideals, according to Martineau, I quote, "immutability, patience, indolence, stagnation," end quote, were all crushed by the onrush of white steam power. Once these slow Hindus had, I quote again, hated the Muslims, or she writes, the Mussulmans, for invading with their superior energy, but now what is Mussulman energy in comparison with ours, judged by our methods of steaming by sea and land? And this kind of techno-racism, if you like, where a hierarchy between the races is manifest in their technological prowess or utter weakness, came to circulate in learned societies and in the science of Europe over the 19th century. In much of these writings, the actual fuel of the steam engine was left unmarked and unsaid, but it was common knowledge that steam derived from coal, that Britain had reserves in abundance, and that British mines had been open for centuries while other people sat ignorantly on top of theirs, and that wherever they went, British colonizers searched for extra coal to dig up. But sometimes this material substratum of dominance was brought to the surface, as when the already quoted MacGregor Laird stated that we are the chief repository of it, our mineral wealth is the source of the superiority. So it's coal that give us, as white people, superiority. But sometimes it was alluded to, at others hidden. But on occasion, an agent of the empire would also draw a straight line from this base to the summit of racial power. And I'll take one example from New Zealand, where a man called John Turnbull Thompson was the surveyor general of this colony in the 1850s and 60s. And in a lecture he delivered in 1876, he recalled how the South Island of New Zealand had been in a state of wilderness when he arrived. But since then, the railway system had made rapid strides, along with foundries producing steam engines and machinery for coal mines. Progress had a very clear sign in the sky. The tall chimneys everywhere rising indicate that in this part of the world, all the skilled trades have found a suitable and ever-increasing location. And then painting on a broader canvas, Thompson retraced the advances of steam across America and Asia, from the Mississippi to the Yangtze, before returning home to New Zealand to retell an anecdote about a Maori girl killed, cooked, and eaten by her own race. Was this not the shadow of coming events, an allegory of the certain fate of so inhuman a race? He wrote. Likewise, the red-collared man has been swept off the face of the northern continent of America. And then, after serving this global theater of violence, Turnbull reached his punchline. I quote again. Then, what has made the white man, or more conspicuously the Anglo-Saxon of the Teutonic race, so ubiquitously progressive and aggressive, this more especially of so recent a date? It is his humanity and science combined with steam. And what makes steam for him? It is coal. What then has coal to do with our race? As far as we know yet, everything. So Turnbull directly derived the superiority of the white race from coal and its powers. And I could give many more examples of this kind of racist ideology production in the 19th century, but time is running out. So let me wrap up by saying that the argument here is that in the 19th century, a link was forged between fossil fuel technologies and the power and perceived superiority of white people. And that link was deeply sedimented in popular consciousness in Europe and the United States. And I haven't gone into the US here, but American racism, particularly in the decades around 1900, took on a very similar kind of justification. And a similar techno-racism evolved in the US to justify white supremacy. This kind of white techno-racism has then undergone various kinds of transformations, but our argument is that part of this link between whiteness and fossil fuel technologies appear to come to the fore in this moment of crisis when precisely these technologies are threatened. Now, obviously, steamboats are a thing of the past, so it's not a matter of the far right defending steamboats. This is a link that has developed contingently over history and that has taken on other forms. And perhaps the most central technology for the far right at this moment is the fossil-fueled car that is aggressively defended by the far right in Europe and in the US. And if you look at what's been going on in the US over the past months, from this perspective, it's actually quite interesting that white supremacists systematically use SUVs to drive into Black Lives Matter protests and crash into the demonstrators. This has a kind of symbolism that maybe not everyone on the scene is aware of. But certainly the far right is very explicit about defending the privileges of white people that are built on fossil fuel technologies. And this process of construction, if you like, a fossilization of whiteness, has developed over 2 centuries. It emerged first in the 19th century, and then continued in the 20th, very much focused on the car. And we have a long chapter on automobility and racism, where we focus on the US. But I don't have the time to go into it now. But the argument is that to understand racism, we always have to understand how it has developed historically. And it's impossible to understand racism without taking into account the history of imperialism over the past centuries. And the globalization of fossil fuel combustion came about through imperialist aggression and expansion in the 19th century. And we would also argue, or I would argue, that it's impossible to understand the climate crisis without taking this history deeply into account, because it really is fundamental to how this system evolved on a global scale. Now, again, I could go much more into contemporary details about, for instance, if you look at the UK, the contemporary far right, including its Tory iterations with Boris Johnson and his pals, they have a deep abiding loyalty to the British Empire and to fossil fuel technologies. This is just one case of this old link coming back to the fore. But I think time is up, and I should stop it there.
Thanks a lot, Andreas, for that wonderful tour through the 19th century sort of origins of this, and that brief snapshot of its transmission down to our present time. So what we'll do now, how we'll proceed now, is we'll pose a series of questions. Anybody who has questions, please type them into your chat box. We'll keep, I'll keep track of them, and I'll keep sort of posing them to Andreas as we go ahead. So that's how you can keep asking questions. In case you've missed a portion of the talk and so on, this talk will be available on the YouTube channel of Teachers Against the Climate Crisis. So please be aware. There's a link to the channel that Mayank has posted right away. So as other people are sort of gathering their question, Andreas, I had a couple, so I'm gonna use the privilege of the chair to sort of set the ball rolling a little bit. So this was really fascinating, and again, it's a vast sort of historical canvas. I had actually two sort of curiosities. One, how does techno-racism as a source of racism within imperialism sit with other strands that were also developing at the same time? So would you, for instance, make a distinction between techno-racism and, say, scientific sort of superiority as a measure of this thing, or the ways in which anthropology, anthropometry, a whole lot of other discourses which were sources of racism developed, or economic expansion even at a certain point in time. So one is sort of, how does techno-racism sit with other sources of sort of 19th century and especially late 19th century racism, including eventually coming from Darwin and so on. But at the other end of your time period, another set of questions which has to do with, why is the far right the unique inheritor of this, of what might be called the common the common inheritance of the European imperialist countries? Why should the far right be uniquely well placed to be the inheritor of this?
Yeah, these are both very good and big questions. Now, my reading of 19th century racism is that it's very hard to draw any sharp boundary between techno-racism and various types of biological racism, you know, partly because racism is never a logically coherent theory. It's a model and very often extremely illogical. So you, I mean, you can find in this sort of pseudo-scientific literature from the second half of the 19th century claims that white people are superior as evidenced by their use of steam power. That's a manifestation of their biological superiority, which might be rooted in I don't know what we would today, yeah, in biological inheritance, basically. But you have others saying that it's actually the mastery of technology as such that that made white people superior. So sometimes it's the effect of white superiority. Sometimes it's the cause of it, and this all tends to be mixed up. So I don't think that you can separate techno-racism. It doesn't seem to me that it's a separate species of racism apart from the others, but that it's interlaced with these other anthropological, biological types of racism that emerged in this period of time, and the tropes of you know, steam powered superiority or technological superiority pops up in all sorts of different contexts and with different modulations or valences or whatever you want to call it. Now, the far right. Well, our interpretation of the far right is that its particular vocation, if you like, in Europe and the United States and also in Brazil, the parts of the world that we look at, and this, I guess, is different from India, because India, I mean, the Hindu nationalism that I know little of has a different historical trajectory as far as I can tell. In the European case, European far right, the American far right, the Brazilian far right, all hark back upon a sort of European whiteness as their core identity and constituency, and the far right in a country like my own really is working to protect what they understand as white people, even though the term whites are not used in Sweden as it is used in the US in the same way, but that is actually what they mean, and the kind of people that they talk about. So the far right in those countries is the political subject that most explicitly defends the privileges and interests of white people. So presumably, if there is a link between whiteness and fossil fuels, you would find it most easily detected or observable precisely on the far right. That is not to say that obviously that the link between whiteness and fossil fuels is exclusively resides on the far right. To the contrary, our argument is that the far right articulates a link that is deeply embedded in how our societies work and how they have come to develop over the past centuries. So the argument is that the far right wouldn't be able to, and here we draw a little bit on Althusser, wouldn't be able to interpolate white people through with anti-climate politics if it wasn't the case that the white subject had been deeply shaped by fossil fuel technologies over a very long period of time. So the far right is not in any way an anomaly to Western societies, but rather, in a sense, is the most honest voice for these racist legacies that we have in our Western societies. Yeah.
Okay, there's actually quite a few questions. One is a curiosity about emissions and deforestation in Sweden. That's being asked by Kamal from Nepal. Protati is asking about how do you see the current phrase out in the UK with not burning coal for a few months, and how does it fit into this this particular picture and into this narrative? So maybe you could take sort of those two questions first, and then
Yeah. So Sweden, very briefly. As I mentioned before we started recording, emissions in Sweden have been rising in recent years, in spite of the fact that we have a government with a Green Party that has a lot of minister posts, cabinet posts. This is not primarily caused by deforestation, even though we have a massive problem of clear cutting of forests in our country. But there's not a loss of forest cover in Sweden. It's only that all the forests in Sweden almost are tree plantations that are cut down and then they regrow and then they're cut down again. So there are almost no old growth forests left at all in Sweden. And Sweden is a leading country in Europe in this respect. So this is bad for the climate, but the reason our emissions have been on the increase in recent years is primarily because of transportation. So you have more cars and you have bigger cars, and absurdly, the rising share of SUVs in the car fleet of the world is the second largest source of emissions increase of the past decade. So the main source, this is according to the International Energy Agency, the main cause is increase from power generation, but the second largest source of growth in CO2 emissions is the shift from standard cars to sports utility vehicles. And these, as an aside, these are precisely the vehicles that the far right tends to be most fond of. Most in love with. What I should say that one absolutely key country to these developments in Europe is Germany. And in Germany, as in many other countries, 2019 was a year when climate politics was on the top of the agenda. And Germany had the largest climate strikes of any country in the world. Most people went out on the streets in Germany. And Germany is probably the country in Europe with the strongest climate movement. And Germany, with its very special history, now also has the typical European far-right party in the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which during 2019 announced that fighting immigration is no longer our main cause. It is to stop climate alarmism. So climate change, stopping this insanity around climate change is now our main cause. That's what the AfD said in 2019 in direct reaction to the popular mobilizations. And the AfD twisted, for instance, a very common slogan on the left in Europe is "No human being is illegal." Keine Mensch ist illegal in German. So the idea that no immigrant who comes in here should be treated as illegal because no human is illegal. The AfD countered that with the slogan, "No SUV is illegal." And they had campaigns defending SUVs and making that one of the main planks of far-right politics in Germany, in direct response to the mobilization of the climate movement. Now, all of this entire dynamic has been put on hold by the pandemic. But it's bound to return because the climate crisis is not going away. Now, as for the situation in the UK, we have an analysis of Brexit as being tied up with a mix of xenophobia and hostility to immigration and anti-climate politics. There are clear links between the main Brexit campaigns and climate denialist groups in the UK. And Boris Johnson himself used to deny climate change. He doesn't do so any longer. And he's not an aggressive fossil fuel booster, if you like, in the fashion of Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro, or for that matter, the Polish far right. But he, I think, I mean, obviously, if you compare to the man who would have been prime minister if the most recent election had turned out differently, if you compare to Jeremy Corbyn, Boris Johnson is a politician who continues to postpone and delay any meaningful action on climate change. The gradual phasing out of coal from the UK is an interesting and very hopeful phenomenon that has a lot to do with the expansion of renewables and them becoming so much cheaper. But I don't think we should see the UK as in the throes of a rapid transition away from fossil fuels, because, for instance, you just had the largest fossil gas powered plant in anywhere in Europe approved in the UK. This is at Drax, and this is a plant that will continue to burn fossil gas for many decades into the future if the British government gets its way. And it's expanding oil extraction in the North Sea and things like that. So regardless of some rhetoric that might sound like Boris Johnson has some sanity around the climate, I think fundamentally what he is doing and what far-right governments in Europe are doing in the case that they no longer aggressively deny climate is that they do everything to slow down meaningful mitigation and postpone it into the future and let business as usual continue. Yeah.
So we have actually a couple of linked questions on the other side of the middle, as it were. So Rajeshwari is asking, how does techno-racism compare with developmentalism, also driven by technology and factor productivity, with labor, women, nature, etc., all becoming factors like energy?
Yeah.
And actually, Buddhaditya is sort of pointing to the connection there, because what he's mentioning is that actually anti-colonial and anti-imperialist leaders of the third world, like Nehru and other leaders of the non-aligned movement, look to fossil fuel technology and industrialization as solutions to poverty and hunger in a period of decolonization. So how do you see this developmentalism as it goes? I mean, Muhammad Ali is a good example also of that.
Yes. So, I mean, in a sense, there's a link between techno-racism and developmentalism in that the kind of technological complex that was built up originally from the white metropolis, these kind of technological complexes are conceived as the pinnacle of human progress. In the developmentalist scheme of things, it's a place that everyone should strive. Everyone, including people outside of Europe, should strive to reach this pinnacle. And here, clearly, the British Empire and other Western empires have been extremely successful in implanting all over the world its own technologies as the models of human existence to which everyone else should strive. And it's one of the great post-colonial tragedies that so much of the formerly colonized world actually has done precisely this, trying to catch up with Europe and copy Europe and build its own coal-fired power plants and all of this. I mean, if you take Egypt, for instance, Egypt is right now constructing what they say will be Africa's largest coal-fired power plant, and quite probably one of the world's largest, in conjunction with Chinese engineers and companies. And this is clearly, I mean, this exacerbates the climate problem, and it's part of the general post-colonial tragedy of the former colonies trying to emulate their colonizers in various respects. And it clearly goes very much against what Frantz Fanon recommended towards the end of The Wretched Earth, namely that we try to find other ways for humanity, because these ways that Europe has created are catastrophic. He didn't talk about fossil fuels and anything like that. I think he was very much in favor of oil production in Algeria. But now, if not earlier, it really is the time to ask if the global South should continue to try to copy the white Western model. So I think techno-racism and developmentalism are sort of communicating vessels. The idea that the white way of life is the best one. And it might appear so, but we now know that that way of life comes with incredible costs for, in particular, non-white people, who still tend to be the most vulnerable and exposed to those consequences.
So I'm going to sort of ask a few questions that might or might not be sort of intimately related and things. So Larry Lohman has a question. There's been a lot of appreciation of the talk, I should say, Andreas. Lots of people are saying fascinating talk and so on.
Yeah.
One question for now. Accompanying and reinforcing fossil capitalism in the 19th century was the development of thermodynamics, that is the commensuration of different energies, the reorganization of territories around a logic of degradation, etc. In other words, thermodynamics was inherently white. And today, climate activists and energy transition enthusiasts, without rejecting thermodynamics, have to decide what kind of relationship they need to have to the whiteness of thermodynamics that they assume and propound. It seems to me that this is another angle on the issue you are brilliantly addressing. Would you agree? The other question here that I'm just going to sort of throw toward you, two questions at you at a time. The far right also tends to exhibit hyper-masculinity, one manifestation being the use of SUVs, as you're talking about. How do you see the connection between techno-racism and patriarchy gender?
Yeah, okay, I'll start with the second one because I think it's maybe easier to answer, and it's more central to the argument in our book. You're absolutely right that hypermasculinity is completely central to what the far right is doing here. And let me just say that the term we use in the subtitle of the book, fossil fascism, was first coined by Cara Daggett, who wrote what is, in my view, a path-breaking article on what she calls petromasculinity, where she analyzes the kind of far-right version of hypermasculinity and how it is predicated on fossil fuel combustion, on large cars, and things like that. So this is absolutely central, and I think we could have written a book as thick as this one will be only on that theme. The race is at the center of this book, but you could just as well focus on gender, I would say. And gender is absolutely central to the far right in all the countries that we have studied. It's deeply anti-feminist, and concerns about the climate are framed as feminine, as weak, and strong men are presumably those who rest their power on coal and oil. Now, as for the whiteness of thermodynamics, I'm not really familiar with this. With this analysis, did Lohman write about this? Yeah, okay, yeah, I haven't read this, but I mean, yeah, I to me, instinctively, or I mean, if I'd make a quick assessment of this argument, it doesn't seem that the first and second laws of thermodynamics as such are contingent upon whiteness or racism. They seem to have, as far as I understand, universal application, even though the people who discovered them might well have been white racists. And yes, the development of the science of thermodynamics was, well, it came straight out of steam engineering. But I mean, being a critical realist and being committed to a fairly realist understanding of science, I would not advocate that we ditch thermodynamics or other parts of natural science that have been powerfully validated because they have historical ties to racism. It is completely different with pseudo scientific racist theories that have been falsified and that have been demonstrated as actually false. That's the fundamental reason why we don't believe in pseudo scientific racism, is because it's incorrect. It's untrue. Thermodynamic science, as far as I understand, doesn't face that problem.
Okay, so a couple of other questions. I'm just sort of trying to figure them into a frame, but I'll just take them in the order they came. So there's a question, perhaps not relating so much directly to this talk, but going back to some of your earlier work. Nagraj is asking, how does your work take on frameworks that view the climate crisis in terms of the Anthropocene? And what are the political implications involved? And a second question is asking about religious fanatics. This is from Manjeet. Religious fanatics, Christians, Muslims, Hindus do cite consequences of climate change as evidences of apocalypse, Qayamat, and what have you, to strengthen their positions. Any, if any, experience, idea of driving the scientific conclusions home to them? That is to say, how do you get the science to people who aren't interested?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So firstly, on the Anthropocene, very briefly, I don't have any quarrel necessarily with the term the Anthropocene, as long as it's not used to build a narrative, to tell a story that goes like this. The human species has created the climate crisis and the ecological crisis. It's all of us, or even all humans that ever existed, as Amitav Ghosh very unfortunately argues at one point, that have created this mess, because it's not what actually has happened in history, and it still very much is not the case. The production of this climate catastrophe is centralized. It's not evenly distributed. It's certain classes in the world that have created and insist on upholding what we refer to as business as usual. So you might call this the Anthropocene if you like, but the important thing to me is that you, in your understanding of the climate crisis, put the inequalities center stage. The inequalities in the production of the crisis and the inequalities in how the consequences play out. Because anything else is a massive distortion of reality, both historically and in the present. Now, on religious people, well, my own experience here is from the Middle East and from Egypt, where I've done some research on how people cope with climate change impacts, and there you quite often hear that it's in the hands of God. If the water rises, or if we don't get any rain, or whatever it is, you know, the weather is often associated with God. And this might be one of the major obstacles to popular climate action in countries where religion still has a firm hold on people's beliefs. But I think there comes a point when people in Egypt and in other places in the global south will realize that, you know, this steadily rising tide of disasters has a link to emissions and wealth amassed in the global north. And I mean, religion is an incredibly multifaceted phenomenon, and I'm sure that there will be forms of religion that can articulate this. I mean, I'm sure even Islamists that I don't particularly appreciate can find a way of articulating this as hostility to the West. I mean, in fact, Osama bin Laden in one of his latest communiques blamed climate change on the West and integrated it into his worldview. And I think that can happen. This is just an extreme example, but I think there are religious discourses that can be mobilized for climate rage, if you like, from the global south. So I don't think we have to. I don't think we have to. It's to set ourselves the task of enlightening people and getting them out of religion to realize to understand what the climate crisis is all about. But how to get more people to understand what it is about? Well, I don't know that if I have any answer to that, and I don't think I, who sit in Sweden, should tell anyone how to get Muslims in Egypt or Hindus in India to combine their religious beliefs with insights into the climate crisis. I'm not the one to tell, really.
So Nagaraj had another question, which is viewing right-wing politics not from the perspective of the top, of the leaders, but from the bottom as a mass movement. Is there a more mixed view about climate change among ordinary right-wing supporters and followers? Less skepticism than earlier, given its impacts are getting more visible and obvious, for instance, in places like Australia, California, and so on. So in a sense, I guess this would be your test case. If it's not the effects, then the effects manifesting in the first world are those shifting people's minds.
Yeah. So there are a lot of quite contradictory data on this. Some data suggest that supporters, people who vote for far-right parties in Europe have a greater awareness of the crisis and deny it much less than the actual leadership of these parties. But there's data that suggests the opposite. And some research suggests that if you have very firm ideological commitments to climate denial, the personal experience of a climate disaster might not actually change your opinion. This is from the US. And if you look at Australia, the wildfire inferno of late 2019 and early this year seems to have hardened climate denial on parts of the Australian right, on far right. Although in the eyes of everyone else, they just look more and more insane. But I mean, it's the same in the US, which isn't exactly a country that has been completely spared of climate disasters in recent years. But still, the far right is as denialist, if not more so, than it has been over the past decade. And to understand these processes, I really think you need to go to psychology and psychoanalysis. So we draw a lot on Adorno and the authoritarian personality and other works like that in our attempt to grapple with what's going on here. With I mean, this sort of denial is deeply linked to narcissism and perhaps even the death drive and other psychological syndromes, if you like. And it's because it's so irrational, it's difficult to understand it without taking these factors into account.
So another couple of questions. Isn't globalization one of the reasons for everyone trying to emulate the West and desperate to catch up with them? The Films for Action video by Helena Nordberg Forge on the economics of happiness explores how going local ensures a sense of contentment that can impact climate change. So isn't sort of thinking at that large scale the problem, I guess, is the question that's being asked. From Zohra, that was a question from Shalini. From Zohra, how does the space race, conquering and colonizing space, link up with, sound similar to, collide with techno-racism? Do you think technology needs to be slowed down as an answer to fascism and racism?
Can I just, I have to do something for 30 seconds. Is that okay? I'll be back with you in 30 seconds.
Yeah, please take your time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so while we have this break, I've just added a message in the chat box for all to say that our series continues on the 26th. The talk by Professor M.V. Ramana on why nuclear power is not the solution to the climate crisis. Any of you interested, again, just please email us at teachersagainsttheclimatecrisis@gmail.com.
Time.
Sorry, yeah, that particular talk would be at 10 a.m. because of the time zone. Ramana is in the US, so it will be at 10 a.m. Indian time. Yeah. It's in the
Okay, so I'm back. Yeah. So
Go ahead.
So the first question was about globalization, and the second was about space race. But let me just the question was: is it globalization? Can you recap the first question for
In a
me?
certain sense, the scale at which the thinking is happening isn't globalization one of the reasons for everyone trying to emulate the West? And I think what's meant here is the contrast with the local way of thinking as compared to, say, this globalized way of thinking. And the other is about the space race and how does it relate to techno-racism. Is it an extension? Is it? I guess those would be sort of glosses on.
Yeah. Globalization. Well, definitely yes, absolutely. Globalization is the form for the universalization, if you like. Although it isn't a universalization, but a geographical spread of this way of life, certainly. So I'll just affirm that basically. On the space race, well, I know very little about space technology, I have to say, and what's going on that front. But let me just say that Donald Trump and others of his kind have a particular way of posing as the conquerors of the world and as the embodiments of a kind of scientific progress, which is obviously heavily slanted towards certain kinds of engineering and mechanical and energetic power. And I guess the space technology fits into that. And people like Donald Trump and the far right in Europe, they purvey a vision of themselves and of white people as being still the carriers of progress and productive. So there is this productivism on the far right, the idea that we white people are the ones that actually make stuff and that improve things and that carry science forward. Whereas immigrants in the European context in particular are basically parasites that just come to leech on our resources. I mean that kind of productivism is very fundamental to what the far right is, and certain types of technology such as the space race might fit into that. Perhaps, but I know very little of it, I have to say.
So I actually had a question. There was a tantalizing mention about France and how the far right in France is slightly different from some of these traditions. It does a certain kind of nationalist, nation-based response to the to climate denial, or nation-based sources of climate denialism. I'd be intrigued to actually hear a little bit more, because that sounds very similar to the kind of thing that might happen, and maybe not just only on the far right in the case of India. And I guess the broader point there is sort of race level thinking versus nation level thinking. Do you see do you see these as competing dynamics? Do you see these as sort of totally symmetrical dynamics? They're more or less the same thing in all of these settings. Is it nationalism more than sort of race level thinking? That's the more serious question. And that's it.
Yeah. Well, let me just lay out some of the core themes of green nationalism as we see it. One of these themes is good old Malthusianism, which says that the climate problem is a result of people overbreeding. And overbreeding is something that non-white people do. It's the people in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and Asia that have too many babies, and this is what destroys the climate. This is a very common argument among green nationalists. This is what motivated supposedly Brendan Tarrant to commit his massacre in Christchurch, for instance, and the killer in El Paso said the same thing. And this kind of argument you can hear on the Finnish far right, which has moved towards green nationalism, and you can hear it a lot from on the French far right. And that kind of Malthusianism is deeply racist. It's about certain kinds of people having too many children, and it's obviously faulty. It's incorrect, because if you look at countries where you have high fertility rates, and these are the countries where you tend to have the lowest emissions. And the largest emissions happen in countries with very low population growth. So there is no correlation, and then hence there can be no causation. It's actually not the case that it's because Mozambicans or Afghanis or Somalis or Haitians have too many children that we have a climate that's about to collapse. It's completely untrue. So this kind of green nationalist take on climate is a sort of secondary denial where the problem of climate change as such is accepted, but it denies everything we know about the drivers of the problem. It denies all the social science and fairly common knowledge about how emissions happen and where they come from. But then there are other. I mean, in Europe, where politics has become so dominated with the question of migration up until the pandemic, in Europe, on the far right, everything boils down to hostility to immigrants. That's essentially the core of the far right in Europe. And on the green. When it comes to green nationalism and the French far right, that translates to the position that by keeping immigrants out, we can save nature and protect the climate. And the argument here can be that if you allow immigrants into our countries, if we allow people to come from Northern Africa or from Sub-Saharan Africa into France, they will increase their emissions by coming here. So it's better for the climate that they stay where they are. And when they come here, they also make claims on our resources and things like that. So, and there's also an argument that's very distinctive and characteristic of the French far right that says that we should protect our countryside, our farmers, from the ravaging of global trade, of world trade, and we should close our borders both against immigrants and against much of world trade. So we should become more self-sufficient and move towards autarky. And one of the main upcoming leaders of the Front National, now Rassemblement National, coined this phrase that ecology is the defense of the border. So by closing our borders, we will save nature. That is a position that is almost hegemonic on the French far right, and you can find it in other parts of the far right as well. including in Germany. But the interesting thing is that it never translates into any actual proposals for how to mitigate climate change. It only translates into so many new ways to attack immigrants.
So we're getting close to the end of our time. There is one question that I must ask because actually it was asked a lot earlier and it slipped out in the order. So this is from Mayank. He asks, we may not have seen global racial domination earlier, but historically in India, racism can be seen in various shades: Turks versus Indians, Dravidians versus Aryans, etc. In what ways is 19th century racism different and more dangerous? What is special about 19th century racism as compared to other forms of race thinking that might have existed, or identity-based thinking that might have existed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, the argument here is not that racism began in the 19th century and that it first appeared then. I mean, most scholars of racism would probably say that systematic racism began with with European enslavement of Africans. The colonization of the Americas, which obviously preceded the steam engine and the technologies of the 19th century. Now, I should repeat that I don't know the history of racism in India very well, but my understanding of the 19th century in India and in other parts of the world is that was the moment in time when the British Empire, predominantly, but other Western empires as well, subjugated almost all of the rest of the world and united the world in an overarching framework of dominance. A very materially concrete dominance, and in this framework, European racism was properly globalized for the first time, because it was only in the 19th century that European racism became a material structure of power throughout India, and even though obviously the colonization began before the 19th century, but that was the century when it really, when the program was realized in full, and that's the century when the Middle East and China were fully subordinated to Europe as well. So the 19th century, I guess, is a key century in the history of racism, in that's when European Western white dominance matured and became as consummated as it could be, I guess.
Sorry, maybe there's it just remains, Andreas, thank you so much for agreeing to come to speak to us. It's been fascinating, and I'm sure it's been a lively discussion session, and I think it's testimony to just how stimulating your work now and before has been. We look forward to sort of hosting you again, perhaps at some point in the future.
I'd love to. Thank you so much. I hope we can meet in person at some point. That would be great.
I mean,
and keep up the wonderful work you're obviously doing. Incredibly important.
Thank you. To stay in touch.
Yes.
Thank you very much. The general announcement. Please do note the next talk that we're going to be having, which is about how nuclear energy is not the way forward. This will be by Professor M.V. Ramana, and it'll be on Wednesday, 26th. So it's also just 10 days from now, rather than our usual 2 weeks. And it'll be at a different time, 10 a.m. IST. So do join us for that if you can. So yeah, thanks, Andreas. Thanks everyone.
Thanks so much, Denise, and everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.